Okay, guys, so I'm sure you've noticed yourselves that we've had a lot of girl bosses up on the stage today. And for our second last speaker, we have another girl boss who will be gracing the ShipperCon stage. Our next speaker is Clare Dillon. Clare is an open source and inner advocate, currently a PhD researcher with the University of Galway, investigating code ownership concepts in InnerSource. Another boss who wears many hats, has many accomplishments a mile long in a short span of time. We are honored to have you speak on our ShipperCon stage today, so please give a warm round of applause to Clare Dillon.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. So I suppose the theme of today's conference is all about the unknown, known unknowns, unknown unknowns. And the reason why I'm coming here to talk about InnerSource is because I think InnerSource is a way of working that really helps organizations get ready for the unknown. Because it allows organizations more flexibility in terms of where they're getting great ideas, where they're getting code development coming from, who gets to work with whom. For all of these reasons, InnerSource actually helps organizations be more flexible, develop their talent, and access the talent in the most flexible way possible. So before I start, who here has heard of InnerSource? Okay, good. Who here is practicing InnerSource? Ooh, excellent. I should talk to all EE later because I'm definitely interested in finding out more people doing it in Ireland. So great to see that some people are already familiar with the concept. But before I start, I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of background about how I got here. I'm not a developer, but I've always worked with developers. So I started off being a product manager a long time ago now, at the start of the tech industry in Dublin, and I was product manager with Iona and Havoc. And then I actually worked in Microsoft for years doing developer engagements and community, and I headed up the developer evangelism team there. We were responsible for Visual Studio, so I got into understanding how developers work and what makes their development teams tick. But about 5 years ago, I got more involved in the open source community. I started working with an organization called Nearform, who I know many of you, some people are familiar with here anyway. I've met some old colleagues here today. But basically, when I started working with Nearform, I became introduced to the open source communities. Now, I'd heard about open source in Microsoft, but I'd never actually been involved in open source communities and started working with open source contributors. And that was where I also found out about InnerSource. So since then, I've become hooked. I think that InnerSource, I think open source is great, but I also think InnerSource is an amazing practice that can really help organizations. And for about 3 years ago, I became the executive director of InnerSource Commons, which is a global community for InnerSource practitioners. And I'm also involved in a number of open source communities like Chaos and Sustain. And I've also set up a community in Ireland called Open Ireland Network, which is about people who are interested in promoting open source in Ireland and what that means and business development opportunities around that. So yeah, last little while ago, made a switch again, and I stepped down as the executive director for InnerSource Commons to take up a PhD in the University of Galway, looking even more deeply into InnerSource practices and what makes them tick. So that's a big change for me, but I'm loving it so far. But that's to give you a little bit of background about where I'm coming from. But now I'll get into InnerSource. So some of you may be familiar with diagrams such as this. This is the Gartner hype cycle for software engineering that was released last year in 2022. Now, when we saw this in InnerSource Commons, we all got terribly excited because for the first time, inner sourcing appeared on the Gartner hype cycle. Are you guys familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, like what it means? But basically, they track trends in software development, and they maintain that basically when something comes out, it goes on this kind of hype cycle curve where you go up to the peak of inflated expectations and it comes down to the trough of disillusionment when everyone says it's not as good as they said it was. We're still obviously in the hype growing stage of InnerSource, so I'll put that out there just so you know. There's promises out there. It's not necessarily really easy to get going with InnerSource, but it's easy to get started so I should say, it's not, trivial to be able to get InnerSource working at scale, but it is easy to get started with. And we do see huge benefits for folks that are actually doing InnerSource almost immediately. So to go into where it came from, this is Tim O'Reilly from O'Reilly Publishing fame. He actually coined the term back in the early noughties. So InnerSource has been around for quite a long time. At that time, he actually set up a company to actually go and teach open source methods within organizations, which is essentially what InnerSource is. So taking how you do open source, bringing it into organizations, and then letting them build proprietary code using those methods. And at the time, when he kickstarted that company, it didn't really take off. And most people would say that it's probably because at that time, open source hadn't won yet. People were still a little bit kind of cautious about it, didn't really know about how to use it in a corporate setting. But then came along 2015. This woman is Denise Cooper, and she's on the stage at OSCON in 2015. And at that point in time, she was the head of open source at PayPal. And she'd been brought in to get PayPal contributing to the open source community. And what she realized was that actually they weren't ready to do that. There was too many people who were embedded in doing software development in closed environments, and they didn't really know how to interact with software developers in the open source world. So she came back to this idea of InnerSource, and because she was an open source advocate, decided that as she was doing her work in PayPal, she was going to make everything public. So she made all her training materials public in a community called InnerSource Commons, and that was when this started really taking off. So what is it? Well, we start with what is open source. Most of you will be familiar with this. It's code that is visible, that can be modified, and can be shared. But open source is not just code with an OSI-approved license. Most of you, who here has contributed to an open source project? Right, great. So you all know that it's not just about a license. You really have to understand things like the tools you use, the processes you use, and the culture of the open source world is different than in many traditional software engineering houses. The whole idea of creating a pull request, making changes, getting reviewed, that doesn't necessarily always happen in these corporate environments. So open source is not just code, it's a way of working. And InnerSource then is that way of working applied behind a firewall to create proprietary code. So it means that within an organization, the code that you're writing on is visible to, hopefully, the entire organization. It can be modified through pull requests, and people can contribute to it, even if they're not the core development team that's writing the code. And through that, it can be shared much wider in the organization, and people are able to collaborate across organizational silos. So when we're talking about InnerSource, oftentimes we're talking about what are the tools you need to get working, what are the processes that need to change within an organization to actually help InnerSource, and what kind of culture needs to be in place so that it's really, really effective. And that last one is actually a really, really interesting topic that takes up a lot of time when we're talking about it in the community in InnerSource Commons. So what does it look like? Well, when people are talking about how to actually make InnerSource work within an organization, the first thing that everyone is talking about is basically, how do you even make your code visible? Like, it sounds like it's an easy thing to go in and just like tick a box, but if you think about the governance, security policies, various different things that are happening within large organizations, that can actually be a complex step in itself. So the first step that people have to look to is, how do you make your code visible, and how do you make it discoverable within an organization? So just like open source, there's no point in just like ticking the box, making it visible, and throwing it over the wall and saying, hopefully everyone will see how wonderful I am. That's not how it works. So you actually have to put effort into actually making the code that you want to get shared findable, discoverable, so people actually understand that they can use it. And so a lot of people talk about using directories and things like that. But most importantly, there's a huge focus on documentation. And with great InnerSource practices, one of the major benefits that people actually report is that the teams doing InnerSource have much, much better documentation. Because they're building it, they're writing their documentation for other people to be able to understand their code. It actually means that the code they're writing is more sustainable itself, because as new people come onto the team and get onboarded, they have all that documentation there. And in other scenarios, that can often be drop off the list of to-dos as other priorities take over. So huge focus on documentation. And then this whole process of enabling these external contributions into a code base. Now again, code reviews are best practice. Everyone should be doing them anyway. But in traditional development teams, sometimes they're not often done as thoroughly as they might be done. But when you actually have an InnerSource practice working really in a great way, then that process becomes an automatic one where anyone can actually request to make a change to the core code base, and the review process is done in a way and tracked in a way that actually makes that very, very efficient. And a huge focus then on mentoring people. So with this, when InnerSource is actually working within an organization, it means that there's a great ability to actually transfer skills and knowledge between teams. And many organizations are looking to InnerSource not just to make changes to code and to have that collaboration happen, but actually to use it as a way to develop talent outside core engineering teams so they can actually spot people in other parts of the organization who may be great next hires for that team. And then community engagement. So the whole idea of building up internal communities of practice so that folks understand what code is out there to actually be contributed to, what the benefits of InnerSource are. These are some of the core activities that folks that are engaged in InnerSource are actually up to these days. So why is it getting popular now? Because we've seen a huge rise. I mean, you know, it's on the Gartner hype cycle curve, but in InnerSource Commons, we saw a huge boom in the last number of years in terms of people joining the Commons. When I first started with them, there was a couple of hundred people who had been, like, you know, engaging with the actual community. As of a few months ago, there was 2,500 people who were part of that community and over 750 organizations who'd been engaging with the Commons about how to do InnerSource. And we think that the reason for that is because of the rise of remote and hybrid teams. Because there was a time when people thought that you had to have a pizza box-sized team all sitting in one place. And I think COVID really, I suppose one of the positive outcomes of COVID is that we all learned that that's not necessarily true. You know, it's absolutely possible to have remote hybrid teams working together to create great innovation. Now, the open source community always knew that, but now the large corporate organizations realized that A, it was possible, and B, possibly advisable in order to get the best talent working on various different problems. So that was one of the reasons that's forced this InnerSource practice, because InnerSource gives you the methods and practices to actually make that remote collaboration work really well. And of course, then there's also the war on talent. There aren't enough software developers in the world. And if you want to, I suppose, put yourself out there as being a very progressive organization, InnerSource and the fact that you can allow this autonomy and agency within your organization so that folks can actually see what's happening across the organization, that's a really great way to actually attract people into your organization. And the last thing is because there's been this big, huge focus on code reuse and developer productivity. Some of the organizations we were working with reported that, I mean, they're all into this whole idea of trying to actually rationalize their software engineering organizations and reduce the amount of duplicated work, right? Like some of the stories you hear are crazy. We went to one organization where they were talking about the fact that they discovered that there were 36 versions of exactly the same platform running in various different divisions across the company. And the 36 teams all maintaining these you know, huge number of pieces of technology. InnerSource allowed them then to start taking that into one centralized platform that multiple teams used. So InnerSource Commons, as I mentioned, is a community of practitioners. About 2,500 individuals have been engaged with it in about 750 organizations. You don't have to tell people in InnerSource Commons where you work to come and be there, so we're not quite sure exactly how many people and organizations are actually involved, but these are the estimates based on the ones that do tell us where they are. And we do also track the number of people who are out there talking about their InnerSource practices. So if you go to innersourcecommons/stories.org/stories, you can see the kind of organizations and the folks that are out there saying that they're doing InnerSource. And it is huge, I suppose, the breadth of the numbers and types of organizations right across the spectrum, from big tech companies to folks in manufacturing, and it's now a global movement. So we have communities springing up in places like Japan and Brazil. So it's a really growing, fast-growing movement. And this is why people are doing it, typically for these 4 reasons. Either it started, as I mentioned, with open source readiness. That was where PayPal and many of the early practitioners were all about the idea of how do I actually get my developers ready for the open source contributions in the wild, as it were. But more recently, we have a lot of people who are not interested in open source at all. They're actually coming because they just want to break down these silos that have grown up in their organization, where teams are not talking to each other, where there are fights all the time about how to prioritize feature requests. And in order to stop that and to give developers the agency to just be able to do the work that they need to do and scratch their own itch and fix the thing that's been niggling at them for so long, because that allows them to do that, InnerSource allows them to do that, it actually enables innovation. It means that people are just happier because they actually can do that within their organization. So thinking about these reasons, I'll give you some examples of who's doing it and why. So I mentioned PayPal. They were, as I said, Denise was working there when she founded the Commons. They were explicitly doing it for open source readiness. Folks like Comcast have a policy that if you want to open source something in Comcast, you have to successfully have InnerSourced it first. So you have to have proven that you have the wherewithal to actually be able to deal with pull requests, you're able to mentor people, you've got the right documentation in place, and you do that internally in a safe environment before you're allowed to actually publish something as open source code. But when we think about innovation, Bosch were some of the earlier practitioners. They had originally called this internal open source. And we're finding lots of people who might be even doing versions of InnerSource within their organization, but just don't know that there's something out there called InnerSource. But Bosch, when they were doing it, they had multiple divisions across the world, even in different legal entities, and they really wanted to try and get that innovation and people talking to each other across these divisional boundaries. And when they started doing InnerSource, they managed to actually show that there were code contributions going right across the company. They were tracking that, and they were able to show their management that they actually had these relationships being built and innovation happening across these previously siloed divisions, and that was a real big win for them in terms of their business value. Capital One, they were building out a DevOps team, a DevOps platform, and the team realized that in order for their DevOps platform to be adopted by the various different teams in Capital One doing all the various different things, that they needed to give those teams the agency to be able to make the changes that they need. So they used InnerSource as a way to actually get their platform adopted more broadly within the organization. And then I mentioned code reuse and productivity. Santander Bank had multiple versions. They were one of these companies that had multiple versions of an app. They were building it for multiple jurisdictions, and they decided that through InnerSource they were going to consolidate the code base into one code base and then make it available to various different teams. They had a 2-year run rate or plan to actually get this implemented, and I think all their costs were recouped ahead of time in the first year in terms of what they were estimating the savings to be made because they were able to rationalize all that software development into one platform. IBM talk about the fact that Watson NLP platform, their AI platform, back in the early days in IBM, when AI was, in the first time AI was getting all the hype, everyone in IBM were spinning up their own AI teams. They were all getting very excited, apparently, about the idea of being able to do this. And the Watson team wanted to make sure that their NLP platform was going to be the one that was most widely used within IBM. And they used InnerSource again to engage with people to make it a better idea to use their platform than the various different other versions within the organization. And through that, they actually became the default platform for all the teams in IBM to do natural language processing. So again, because of that, IBM are now rolling out InnerSource on a much wider scale because to enable this across the organization to drive innovation. And then we have talent and learning. Sometimes when I've seen people talk about this and even show this slide, they talk about the idea that the next generation need this agency. They want to be able to scratch their own itch. They're used to working in a way that's purposeful and be able to see everything. And I'm kind of thinking, that's not just the youth. We all want that. We just haven't been able to get it for so long. But we all want to be able to scratch your own itch, learn about what's happening across organizations. And so talent and learning in particular is a huge driver of InnerSource. Being able to share the knowledge. I know people who have told me that their InnerSource practices are as important, not even because they want to do code reuse, not even because they have any intention of ever putting a contribution into another team. They just want to see how they did it. They want to be able to go and look at other people's code so they can learn about what's happening in the organization and see what those best practices are. So Microsoft, in fact, were an organization, there's a case study up about how they've used InnerSource, not even for code. They used it for actual creation of materials that their consultants were out in the field with. And they used to have a process whereby if someone was out in the field with a customer and they asked a question, it used to have to go through this editorial process up to the gods, the powers that be, come all the way back down to all the consultants in terms of changing the core publication of the PowerPoints, I guess. And then they decided, well, that's a bit pants, isn't it? So let's do it in this distributed way. And they actually created an InnerSource project, a community of practice. It was all grassroots, and all the consultants got together. And now they have a system whereby if someone's in a customer site and they get asked a question, they can actually answer it into the common materials, get it approved, and it's like rolled out almost immediately then to the entire consultant organization. So it's allowed for this edge innovation and speed of actual change that wasn't possible otherwise. And Morgan Stanley have talked about how they used it as talent development because they had what was essentially a legacy code base, and they couldn't find people with the skills that they needed to actually work on this code base because it was very old. And what they did was they decided to InnerSource it so they could actually identify people who had that passion across the organization and even then let them become familiar with the code base and how to work in that way. And they used it then as a recruitment tool to actually get people into that team, that legacy team for maintenance over time. So it was an interesting use again. So ultimately, the great things about InnerSource is that it definitely helps to break down these barriers between organizations. Now, that's sometimes hard. I'm not going to tell you that it's always easy. You know, sometimes you'll have legal people coming up going, actually, is this really a good idea? Or the security people going, do we really want our code visible? And maybe there are situations where that isn't a good idea. But there are loads of situations where it is a good idea. And I think the notion of making things as perhaps closed as necessary, but as open as possible, is a really good principle to help innovation, to help people build the agility in their organizations to be able to deal with the unknown. Also, there have been reports out there that have shown that people who are adopting open source practices within their organizations have actually increased developer velocity and productivity. Now, I know there's a lot of debate about how you measure that, but at the same time, it is showing that that does drive, it's like a flywheel for innovation within organizations. And ultimately, we hear back from our practitioners and the folks that are in the commons and in that community that people report just being happier when they get to do InnerSource, possibly because they were getting to make relationships across organizations that they wouldn't make otherwise, but ultimately because I think they get that agency and autonomy to be able to do the work that they need to do without having to deal with all the bureaucracy that can sometimes come with traditional organizations that are very, top-down and hierarchical. So I'll finish up here and I'll just say that InnerSource Commons, if you're interested in finding out more, InnerSource Commons website, innersourcecommons.org, has loads of materials. They've got training paths. We write patterns about how to deal with some of the challenges that people come up against. We are a very friendly group of people. I would encourage you all to come along and meet us. There's twice monthly community calls where we always share a particular topic and people share how they've tackled it. It's definitely an emerging practice. I don't think anyone has all the answers, but we're all in it together to try and find out the best way to do this. So if you're interested in it, please come join us. And thank you very much for having me.
You'll notice that my walks are a bit slow now because we're nearly at the end. As much as I've enjoyed all of our speakers today, it's always bittersweet because it means that we're finishing and there's only one more speaker left. So